Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, July 14th, 2023. All right, so the first story that I have for you, this actually just broke when I finished recording, so I'm just inserting this in the front. But the House on Thursday night at about just before 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time, they voted down an amendment to block cluster bomb shipments to Ukraine. So this was an amendment to the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. It was led by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia, and it failed in a vote of 147 to 276. The amendment received support from 98 Republicans and 49 Democrats. I'll put the roll call into this article when it's available so you could see how your representative voted. I'm curious. I didn't look yet to see which Democrats supported it. I'm guessing it's, uh, a lot of the progressives. But the night before the vote, so this is where things get a little strange. So if you remember, covered the original amendment was introduced by Democrats, Rep. Sarah Jacobs, and that would have banned the transfer or export of cluster munitions to all countries, not just Ukraine. So the House Rules Committee, the Republicans on the House Rules Committee, late Wednesday night or early Thursday morning, they voted to get rid of that amendment. And then they added this one, which was led by Marjorie Taylor Greene, and narrowed it down to Ukraine. And I think this was less likely to get Democratic support because they kind of made it a bill not so much against cluster bombs, but against specifically cluster bombs for Ukraine. So they kind of made it an military aid for Ukraine bill. And they made Marjorie Taylor Greene the leader of this. And, whatever you think of her, she is a pretty divisive figure in Congress. So I think this definitely hurt its chances to get support from Democrats. On the other hand, it could have gotten more support from Republicans this way. That's what Thomas Massey, who's on the Rules Committee, that was his argument. But I don't know. I think it could have gone a lot further with the original amendment. But that's where we're at. And even if the amendment passed, it wouldn't have blocked the current shipments of cluster bombs. They already started arriving in Ukraine, and I'll get into that in the next story. And this is the NDAA. Again, this is the 2024 military spending bill. So the House still has to pass their version, and then the Senate has to pass their version, and then they negotiate. And usually during that negotiation process, they kind of get rid of all of the amendments that try to rein things in. And then it wouldn't be until probably towards the end of the year that this actually becomes law, that it actually reaches Biden's desk. So by then they could ship hundreds of thousands or millions of these cluster bombs to Ukraine. And that's another reason why, another argument for, making it more broad, making it banning sending cluster munitions anywhere. Because again, all the cluster munitions that the US has right now could be in Ukraine by the time this NDAA becomes law. But again, it doesn't matter because it was voted down. The House also voted down amendments that were put forward by Greene and Rep. Matt Gaetz to reduce funding for Ukraine. One amendment from Greene would have cut $300 million in military aid for Ukraine that's packed into the NDAA. That's the $886 billion NDAA. That failed in a vote of 89 to 341. Only Republicans voted in favor of that. And Gaetz put forward an amendment that would have cut off all military assistance for Ukraine. And that measure failed in a vote of 70 to 358. So that failed pretty badly. But it's still interesting, 70, it's all Republicans, that there's 70 Republicans willing to vote to completely cut off Ukraine. But anyway, that's it for this story. Now, here's the rest of the show that I just recorded before this. I hope you enjoy. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today: U.S. cluster bombs have arrived in Ukraine. So a Ukrainian general told CNN on Thursday that Kiev has received a shipment of U.S. cluster bombs, which, as we've been covering a lot, are these controversial munitions that have a devastating impact on civilians because they spread these small submunitions, or bomblets as they call them, over a large area. So this general, speaking to CNN, didn't specify how many of the artillery shells that they received. So it's not really clear how much the U.S. is shipping initially. They're giving them cluster munitions in the form of 155 millimeter artillery shells. And the Pentagon has said that they will provide hundreds of thousands of these shells. They have millions of them, so I wouldn't be surprised if they end up sending millions. But right now, they're already there. And this is what I suspected because the Biden administration announced this last week that they're sending cluster bombs using the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the president to send Ukraine weapons directly from military stockpiles. And there's no mechanisms in there for Congress to block it. Giving Biden this authority lets him send Ukraine whatever he wants. So, they're on the way. Well, they're already there. And this general said that they haven't used them yet, that they just got them. And again, I don't want to be too redundant because I've been covering this so much, but, these are so hazardous to civilians because a lot of these small submunitions might not explode on impact. And that leaves behind a bomb that a civilian could come across if it's not cleaned up. These artillery shells are packed with 72, of these little bombs. And even if the dud rate, as they call it, is low, it still is going to leave some behind. So just so dangerous. And they're still cleaning them up in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And, they've been killing and maiming thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of civilians since the end of the Vietnam War. So it just goes to show they don't care about killing civilians. And the argument is, oh, Russia's used them. We might as well use them. And Ukraine has also been using them in the war. So, now the U.S. is a party to it, is a party to using these weapons that indiscriminately kill civilians. And, I mentioned in here last year at the very beginning of the war, the White House said that the use of cluster bombs in the war in Ukraine would be a potential war crime. But now here they are sending them over there. All right, the next one here, the U.S. almost scaled back NATO language for Ukraine. So the Washington Post reported Thursday that U.S. officials at the NATO summit in Vilnius were so angry over Zelensky's criticism that they almost scaled back the commitment made to Ukraine in NATO's communique. So as we've covered, as the alliance was working on the wording of the communique that it issued on Tuesday, Zelensky took to Twitter to air his grievances about Ukraine not getting a formal invitation to join NATO. He called it unprecedented and absurd. So this was before the communique was released. It was while they were working on the language. Zelensky knew what they were going to say, and he complained about it to the whole world. And the final wording of the communique was vague with respect to Ukraine's future membership. It only said that NATO will be in a position to invite Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. So again, very vague. So sources told the Washington Post that the U.S. delegation was furious over Zelensky's tweet, and NATO officials actually got together and held informal talks to decide, how to respond to what Zelensky said. They were very unhappy about it. And according to European officials, the U.S. actually wanted to get rid of the line about Ukraine's future invitation altogether. They wanted to, even that vague commitment, they wanted to get rid of because they were that mad, apparently. But ultimately, the U.S. delegation agreed to stick with the original language. The report said that French President Emmanuel Macron pushed to keep the line about Ukraine's invitation in the communique, and he had the backing of most other NATO members. But I think this spat really highlights, the divisions within NATO and between the U.S. and Ukraine as the alliance was trying to put on this show of unity. That's what all their rhetoric is about, that the whole world is united against Russia. When if you, look at a map of the world and see, who's in on the sanctions against Russia, it's certainly not the whole world. It's the U.S. and Europe and Japan. And that's basically it. So I think this kind of wasn't good for the public image that NATO was trying to put out. And I think that is part of the reason why the U.S. got so mad at Zelensky for that tweet and everything. And the British Defense Secretary said that Ukraine needed to show more gratitude. Jake Sullivan said that the U.S. deserves gratitude. There's clear fractures at this summit. All right, so the next one here, Biden activates 3,000 reservists for Europe. So this is a little concerning. President Biden on Thursday signed an executive order allowing the Pentagon to mobilize 3,000 reservists for deployments in Europe, where the U.S. military has significantly increased its presence since Russia invaded Ukraine. So since February 2022, the U.S. has deployed over 20,000 additional troops to Europe, bringing U.S. troop levels on the continent to over 100,000 for the first time since 2005. The U.S. has beefed up its presence in Eastern Europe. They currently have over 10,000 troops in Poland, which has become a major hub for, U.S. military equipment that's going to Ukraine. That's kind of where it all passes through. So the mobilization of 3,000 reservists, it's kind of strange. It signals that the U.S. military is strained in trying to maintain this large troop presence in Europe. A spokesman for U.S. European Command said that the authority would not change the current force posture levels. So they're not increasing troop levels in Europe. So that suggests that they might use the reservists to rotate out troops that have been there for a while. But yeah, they're basically saying that they're going to use this to ensure, long-term U.S. presence and operations in Europe. The Pentagon said that the reservists will support what they call Operation Atlantic Resolve. So Operation Atlantic Resolve is the name for U.S. military activities in Europe that are done in response to events in Ukraine. And they started this in 2014 after the U.S. backed coup in Kiev when Russia annexed Crimea and the civil war in the Donbass broke out. They started beefing up the presence in Europe. So, this has been a long time in the works. And again, everything's accelerated since the invasion. So, 3,000, troops isn't many, but calling up reservists for this reason, it's concerning because, if things get really hot between the U.S. and Russia or between the U.S. and China or both at the same time, if they have to already call up reservists for this now, it's definitely makes you worry about, a potential draft or something like that. So President Biden signed this order at the end of his trip to Europe that included the NATO summit in Vilnius. On Thursday, he was in Finland, which is NATO's newest member, and it shares an over 800-mile border with Russia. While he was there, he declared that Putin has already lost the war in Ukraine. He's, just kind of bragging about that, whatever that means. This war is clearly not over. And, Finland is a country where the U.S., it looks like, is going to establish military bases there. They're in talks on some kind of deal to that end. So this beefing up in Europe isn't over. So again, they have to call reservists now. What are they going to do when they want to open bases in Finland and Sweden, and not to mention everything that they're trying to do over in Asia? All right, the next one here. Lavrov says that Russia views F-16s in Ukraine as a nuclear threat. So Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Wednesday that Russia will view U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets in Ukraine as a nuclear threat because they are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Lavrov said, quote, "We have informed the nuclear powers, the United States, Britain, and France, that Russia cannot ignore the ability of these aircraft to carry nuclear weapons. No amount of assurances will help here," end quote. So President Biden has given the green light for European countries to deliver F-16s to Ukraine. And 11 of Ukraine's Western backers announced during this NATO summit that they are going to start training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s in August. So the ball is in motion to get them into the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces. So F-16s are capable of carrying U.S. B-61 nuclear gravity bombs, which the U.S. stores in several European countries under NATO's nuclear sharing program. Right now, there's no indication that the U.S. is planning to arm Ukraine with nukes, and I don't think they're that crazy. But Lavrov says that Russia is still going to look at it as a nuclear threat. He said, quote, "In the course of combat operations, our servicemen are not going to sort out whether each particular aircraft of this type is equipped to deliver nuclear weapons or not. We will regard the very fact that the Ukrainian armed forces have such systems as a threat from the West in the nuclear sphere," end quote. So that's concerning. Just the fact that Russia is saying they're going to take this as the West providing Ukraine with nukes, essentially. So what does that imply? What kind of response is that going to bring from Russia? This is what's so scary, really, about all these escalations from the U.S. and NATO is we don't know at what point is Russia going to, uh, you know, have a big response, attack a NATO base or something like that. We don't know, what they're thinking exactly. And Lavrov added that the U.S. and its allies are, quote, creating risks of a direct armed clash with Russia, and this is fraught with catastrophic consequences, end quote. So as I always mention, in the early days of the war, the U.S. and NATO ruled out, they said they wouldn't give Ukraine fighter jets because they thought Russia would view the move as NATO directly entering the war. But now they've sent MiG fighter jets, the Soviet-made jets, and they're working on arming Ukraine with the Western Air Force. So Lavrov has previously said, noted that F-16s could carry nuclear weapons, but this warning was brushed off by the Biden administration. John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, was asked about this last month, and his response was, quote, the first thing I would say to Minister Lavrov is if you're worried about Ukrainian military capabilities, then you should take your troops and leave Ukraine, end quote. So, yeah, they're not taking Russia's warnings, Russia's concerns seriously at all. And that's been the theme as this thing goes on. They care less and less about the risk of escalation. All right, the next one here, U.S. Navy spy plane flies over the Taiwan Strait. So a U.S. Navy spy plane flew over the Taiwan Strait on Thursday as China's People's Liberation Army was conducting drills to the south of Taiwan. The U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet announced the flight of the Navy P-8A Poseidon, and Taiwan's defense ministry said that the plane flew on the south side of the median line, which is an unofficial barrier that separates the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. China said that it tracked the U.S. aircraft and accused the U.S. of hyping the incident. A spokesperson for the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, which is the Chinese military command responsible for the area, Taiwan Strait, and the areas around there. This spokesperson said, quote, the troops of the PLA Eastern Theater Command have tracked and monitored the U.S. aircraft in the whole course and handled it in line with laws and regulations, end quote. So the U.S. frequently sails warships through the Taiwan Strait, and China views those transits as, provocations. Surveillance flights have been less common. U.S. flights over the Taiwan Strait are not as common as the ships, but they're becoming more frequent. The last known U.S. flight over the Taiwan Strait took place in April. Taiwan's defense ministry said that PLA ships and planes conducted a third day of drills on Thursday, so they are conducting drills to the south of Taiwan. But the ministry said that they also detected Chinese aircraft crossing the median line, which the Chinese military used to avoid crossing that line. But since Nancy Pelosi went over to Taiwan last year in August 2022, so it's almost been a year since she made that trip. Since then, China has kept up the military pressure on Taiwan, and they're, kind of using it as a way to respond to the U.S.'s growing military and diplomatic ties with Taiwan, just in general. All this new military aid that the U.S. wants to send and things like that. Of course, China is not happy about it. All right, the next one here. This article is from Declassified UK, and it's about Kosovo and how the U.S. bombed it with depleted uranium. NATO bombed it with depleted uranium. So a convoy. So this is basically just a story. This reporter went over to Kosovo and spoke with locals about, the kind of the high cancer rates in the areas where NATO dropped depleted uranium rounds. For instance, this one mountain, there was at least 286 rounds of depleted uranium fired into this area. And depleted uranium, it's chemically toxic and it's radioactive. It's a byproduct of enriched uranium. And the reason why, they're reporting on this is because the British have sent depleted uranium to Ukraine, and the U.S. is going to be sending it as well when they get their Abrams tanks, which is supposed to happen this fall. So this is another thing. We talk about the cluster bombs. They're going to leave behind these small bombs for civilians to find, and this depleted uranium is going to poison the land. Now, there's all these, the U.S. kind of denies this idea that depleted uranium causes cancer and birth defects, but it's very clear that it does. And that's, what this article is about. And NATO countries have acknowledged that in courts and everything. There's a lot of Italian soldiers during the Kosovo war ended up with cancer because of depleted uranium. So, it's important to note these things when the US and the UK are sending this to the Ukraine. All right, the next one here, Turkey and Hungary to ratify Sweden's NATO bid this fall. So Hungary has said that it will approve Sweden's NATO bid now that Turkey has dropped its objection, but both the Hungarian and Turkish parliaments will not take up the issue until the fall. So Hungary said, and I missed this, they said about a month ago that once Turkey lifts its objection to Sweden joining NATO, then they would too. So they're not holding out anymore. And it's just a matter of time. It's basically their parliaments are out of session right now. They're going to come back into session in the fall. Erdogan said during the NATO summit that they're going to approve Sweden's NATO bid in October. And Hungary is basically saying, well, Turkey's not approving it till then, so we're not going to call an extraordinary session of parliament to ratify their membership. We're just going to wait until then. So it's going to be a few months, but it looks like Sweden is going to become the 32nd member of NATO. It's a huge military alliance, and it's another country that the U.S. is pledging, the defense of, and they're going to work out putting bases there as well. And Sweden, they're ditching their long-standing policy of neutrality that kept them out of the world wars. And to placate Turkey, they changed their constitution. They got these new anti-terror laws. They're extraditing people to Turkey. They did a lot, for Turkey to get into this military alliance. But that is it for the news for today. It was a bit of a slow day today, but you could go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Christian Britsky. Cluster bombs aren't the only weapons that kill people after a war is over. That's over at Reason. And that is a good point. There's a lot of things that can be left behind. One from Norman Solomon. It's always a difficult decision, they tell us. One from Jacob Hornberger over at Future Freedom Foundation. Involuntary servitude in Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. One from Jonathan Grotenfeld. Vice President keeps getting worse on foreign policy. Vice Presidents keep getting worse on foreign policy. And our spotlight is from Ted Galen Carpenter. Is the United States pursuing a permanent Cold War with Russia? That's over at the Libertarian Institute, and it certainly seems like they are. But that's everything for me. That's everything for the week. I'll be back after the weekend. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to this show on YouTube and leave comments. And share the show. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. That's it. I'll be back after the weekend. Thanks for listening.